Popular culture loves to paint the medieval executioner as a shadowy figure in a black hood, waiting in some damp dungeon for the next unlucky soul. Brutal, unfeeling, faceless. But the truth? It's darker, stranger, and far more human than most people are comfortable admitting. This was a job steeped in blood and fear, but also in skill, ritual, and a strange kind of respect. And I'm about to show you exactly what your life would have been like if you were born into this world. Not as a peasant, not as a knight, but as the one who swung the blade. Oh, and if you're enjoying these forbidden corners of history, I'd appreciate a like or a subscribe. I'm always curious where you're listening from. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is right now. Still blows my mind that people fall asleep to this in every corner of the world. All right, time to settle in. Adjust your pillows, pull the blanket a little closer. Because where we're going, you'll want to be warm and still, while the world outside grows cold and loud. Congratulations! You've just woken up in a small drafty room on the edge of a medieval town. The shutters are wooden, warped and let in a thin ribbon of grey dawn. Your bed is a sack of straw on rough planks. The woolen blanket is heavy, scratchy, and smells faintly of smoke and tallow. Somewhere outside, a cartwheel grinds over cobblestones, and a church bell tolls low and slow. Today is not like other days. Today, you work. The tools are already laid out, the sword polished to a mirror edge, the rope coiled neatly, the worn leather gloves stiff with stains that no washing will ever lift. In a few hours, you will walk into the town square, where hundreds will be waiting. Not for you, but for what you will do. The crowd will jeer, some will spit, and yet all will push forward to see. They'll pretend you are a monster, but they will lean in when the moment comes. They always do. You rise from the straw, pull on the heavy tunic, and fasten the belt that holds your tools. Outside, the air is cold enough to sting your nose. Smoke drifts from chimneys, and a group of boys runs ahead of you, already calling to the square to announce the day's work. And as you step onto the frost-hardened street, sword balanced against your shoulder, you can feel the weight of it, not just in steel, but in expectation. Because today you will kill a man, and it will not be the first time. No one grew up dreaming of becoming the man with the blade. In the medieval world, the role of executioner was not an honour but a burden, a job that clung to you like the smell of old blood. It could be inherited, forced, or, in rare cases, chosen out of desperation. However it came, it marked you for life. In many towns, the profession passed from father to son. The logic was cruel but simple. If the people already shunned one family for their trade, why curse another with the same fate? A child born to an executioner was born into exile before they could walk. Their friends were other outcasts, tanners, grave diggers, lepers, people who lived on the edge of the settlement, where the wind carried away unpleasant smells and unpleasant memories. Sometimes the post was given to criminals. A thief, a murderer, or a deserter might be offered a choice. Take up the hood and the sword, or take your place on the scaffold. Many accepted, telling themselves it was only temporary. Few found a way out. Once your hands had ended a life under the city's seal, you were marked as unclean in the eyes of the law and the church. The stain was invisible, but it followed you everywhere. Wages varied. Some towns paid in coin, others in privileges, freedom from certain taxes, the right to sell off the clothes and belongings of the condemned, the use of land no one else wanted. In some places, the executioner doubled as the torturer, the knacker and the flayer, earning his keep by doing every foul task no one else would touch. Training was brutal and direct. There were no schools for executioners, only lessons from those who had swung the blade before you. A veteran might hand you a sack of sand, telling you to practice clean strikes until your arms ached. You learned where to place a blow to sever a head with one stroke, how to judge the weight and balance of your sword, how to tighten a noose so that the drop snapped the neck instead of slowly strangling the victim. Mistakes were costly, not to you, but to the person at the end of the rope or beneath the blade. And the crowd never forgot a botched execution. Socially, you lived in two worlds. The authorities kept you close, the townspeople kept you at arm's length. You might dine with the mayor one day and be refused service at the market the next. Priests blessed your work, but hesitated to bless your house. Your children might be barred from certain guilds or marriages because of your profession. Even in death, executioners were sometimes buried outside consecrated ground, as if the sins of those they killed might seep into the soil. There was, however, one form of power the role offered: fear. Not the fear of a mob or of thieves in the night, but a quiet, personal fear that followed you into every room. People lowered their voices when you passed. Arguments died when you entered a tavern. And in the marketplace, even those who hated you might step aside rather than meet your eye. Still, that fear was a double-edged sword. In times of unrest, the crowd might turn on the executioner first. He was the most visible hand of authority, the one who turned verdicts into corpses. There are records of mobs beating or killing their own town's headsman when a hanging or burning stirred too much outrage. The hood could protect your identity, but not always your life. For those who lasted, the work became routine. You learned to keep your tools ready at all times, for the summons could come without warning. You learned to sleep lightly, for drunks might hurl stones at your windows in the night. You learned the quiet routes through the streets to avoid being cornered by relatives of the dead. And, perhaps most importantly, you learned to separate the act from the man, to treat each execution as a task, not a moral question. Without that distance, the faces would haunt you. Some still did. There was no ceremony when you became an executioner. No badge, no oath, no celebration. Just the first day you stood over the block, rope in hand, and realised that from this moment on, your name would be whispered, your work watched, and your life lived under a shadow no one could wash away. Because in the medieval world, once you took the sword, you never truly set it down. They called it a kit, but it was closer to a cabinet of nightmares. Every tool in it had a history, and if you stayed in the tavern long enough after dark, you'd hear the stories. Not the official ones from court records, but the whispered versions, the ones where the rope snapped, the wheel splintered, the blades sang when it hit bone. Take the sword, for example. The townsfolk might see a polished edge glinting in the sun, a ceremonial flourish before the stroke. But in the hands of the executioner, it was as personal as a lover. One in Frankfurt was said to have been sharpened on the skulls of traitors, its steel drinking the rage of the crowd so that it never missed. Franz Schmidt, the famous Nuremberg executioner, had a blade nicknamed the Swift One, because in 20 years it had never required a second blow, except once when the condemned flinched. People said Schmidt never forgave the man for making him look clumsy. And then there was the rope. It wasn't just hemp, it was measured, tested, and kept dry as if it were a noble's purse string. The length was calculated for the condemned's weight, and if the drop was wrong, the shame was worse than the blood. There's an old story from York. A man condemned for arson paid the headsman to make it quick, but the rope was too short. He kicked and thrashed for 8 full minutes, screaming his innocence with a blackened face, while the crowd spat at the man who'd misjudged the knot. The executioner didn't show his face in the marketplace for a year. Some tools carried a kind of scandal with them. The breaking wheel was the most infamous, brought out only for crimes the law wanted remembered in nightmares. In Lübeck, a merchant was sentenced for treason, and the wheel was chosen not just to kill him, but to humiliate him. The executioner shattered each limb with deliberate pauses, the crowd counting the strikes aloud, like a carnival game. His last blow to the chest was delivered only after the condemned's mistress fainted in the front row. And the iron, the red-hot spitting kind, pulled from a brazier while the accused watched. Officially, they were for branding and sealing wounds. Unofficially, they were for coaxing a confession the court already knew it would get. The Paris executioner's apprentice once burned a heretic's lips for refusing to speak, then sold the charred scraps of skin to a relic peddler who swore they cured blasphemy. There was money in this side of the trade, not clean money, the kind you never declared to the magistrate. Hair, teeth, fat, even bone were sold as charms and cures. In Hamburg, it was said the executioner's wife made soaps from rendered fat of hanged men, sold discreetly to women who swore it erased wrinkles. Everyone denied buying it. Everyone knew someone who had. Even the small things had stories. The blindfold given for mercy could be pulled just enough to block the eyes but leave the nose clear, so the condemned smelled their own blood on the block before the end. The bucket of sawdust, supposedly to soak up blood, could be kicked over to send a splash into the crowd if someone shouted insults. The gallows pins might be loosened just enough so the wood gave a satisfying creak when the trapdoor opened, adding a moment's theatre. An executioner didn't just own tools, he built relationships with them. The sword was confidence, the rope was precision, the iron was persuasion, and the wheel was pure intimidation. You could see it in the way the crowd moved when it was rolled into the square. Even the drunkest heckler sobered. And the greatest secret of all was this: none of these instruments worked by themselves. They were only as swift, as cruel, or as merciful as the man holding them. A clumsy hand could turn the sharpest blade into a public farce. A steady hand could make even the slowest death look like an act of grace. That was the part the chronicles left out, the part the executioner knew better than anyone, because when the tools came out, so did the truth about what the town really wanted. Not justice, not closure, but a performance. And the executioner, steel in hand, was the lead actor. Every execution began long before the blade, rope, or wheel made their appearance. There was a rhythm to it, as familiar to the townsfolk as the toll of the church bell, an uneasy theatre in which every role was well rehearsed. First came the announcement, a bell, a herald, or the slow march of guards through the streets, calling out the sentence. Windows opened, children craned their necks, traders paused mid-sale. Even those who swore they had no interest in such things found themselves drifting toward the square. Some came for justice, some came for spectacle. Most came for both, whether they admitted it or not. The condemned was brought from the prison in a cart or on foot, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in their own clothes, sometimes in a plain shift provided by the authorities. Priests walked beside them, murmuring prayers or urging a final confession. The executioner followed or led, depending on the town's custom, his tools carried with quiet certainty. The square itself was prepared hours before dawn. Officials made sure the block was set, the gallows checked, or the scaffold secured. Space was cleared for the magistrates, the clergy, and sometimes the victims' accusers. The best viewing spots were claimed early, and enterprising vendors sold bread, drink, or small tokens, charms to ward off bad luck from witnessing what was about to happen. Once the condemned arrived, there was a pause. This was the moment for final words, and it was as much for the crowd as for the prisoner. Some spoke with defiance, others with trembling voices asking forgiveness. A few said nothing at all, their silence louder than any speech. The executioner's part began only after this ritual was done. He moved with deliberate calm, setting the scene with small gestures, a sword laid in plain sight, a rope checked for tension, a wheel adjusted so it would turn smoothly. Every movement was calculated to hold the crowd's attention, to remind them that this was not chaos but an act sanctioned by law. There was always a moment, just before the end, when the world seemed to hold its breath. The crowd leaned forward. The condemned closed their eyes or stared into the distance, and the executioner fixed his stance. That stillness was as much a part of the ritual as the sentence itself. It made the next moment, swift, decisive, final, land with the weight of inevitability. When it was done, the reaction varied. Some applauded, others crossed themselves, a few turned away in discomfort. But the ritual wasn't over. The body or its remains were displayed, buried, or otherwise dealt with according to the judgment. The executioner ensured everything was in order, for a mistake now could undo the entire purpose of the day. By nightfall, the square would be swept, the scaffold dismantled, and the traces of the event erased, at least from the ground. In memory, it stayed much longer, and that was the real point of the ritual. Not just to punish, but to leave an impression so vivid that no one forgot what law looked like when it carried a blade. The method of execution wasn't chosen at random. It was part punishment, part message, and part tradition, each one speaking its own silent language to the crowd. The gallows, the block, and the wheel were as much symbols as they were instruments. To the people of a medieval town, each carried its own meaning, before a rope was tied or a blade lifted. The gallows was the most common and perhaps the most public form. It stood high, visible from far beyond the town's walls, its timbers seasoned by sun and rain. Some gallows were permanent, a fixture like the church steeple, there to remind every traveller what happened to thieves and traitors. Others were built just for a single day's work, then torn down before dusk. But whether temporary or fixed, their shape alone stirred a murmur in the crowd when seen in the distance. The block had a different tone. It was reserved for certain crimes, or certain criminals. Nobles, high officials, and those whose deaths needed a semblance of dignity met their end here. There was ceremony to it, the prisoner kneeling, the sword or axe displayed, the crowd hushed in respect or morbid fascination. A clean stroke at the block could even be seen as merciful compared to the rope's slow descent. It was, in the eyes of many, a gentleman's death, though it required the same steady hands and measured breath as any other. Beyond these, there were punishments designed to linger in memory long after the day was done. The wheel, for example, was not just a tool, it was a stage. The condemned was placed upon it so the crowd could see the law's reach and the consequences of its defiance. In some places, the wheel was raised on a post, turning the punishment into a warning for days or weeks after. It was the sort of sentence that didn't end with the last heartbeat. It carried on in the silence of passing travellers who glanced up and looked away. Some methods blurred the line between execution and display. Hanging cages, where the condemned might be left alive for hours or days, were rare but deeply feared. Not because they were always used, but because the mere rumour that they might be was enough to keep whispers quiet and doors locked after dark. The choice of method told a story the authorities wanted told. The gallows spoke of swift justice for common crime. The block whispered of order and rank, even in death. The wheel shouted about treachery and betrayal. stretching the moment into something unforgettable. For the executioner, each method demanded its own preparation. The gallows needed measuring and testing. The block required a perfect edge on the blade and careful placement of the condemned's head. The wheel had to be positioned and reinforced so it wouldn't splinter mid-sentence. To the crowd, these details were invisible, but to the man who did the work, they were the difference between a day's job done and a public disaster that could haunt him for years. No matter the method, the ending was always the same. The crowd dispersed, the tools were stored away, and the town settled back into its rhythm. But for those who'd stood close enough to see and hear, the images lingered. They would carry them home, tell the story at the hearth, and pass it on to those who hadn't been there. And in that way, the gallows, the block, and the wheel did their work twice, once in the square and once in the mind. It was said that without a crowd, there was no execution, only a killing. In the medieval mind, justice wasn't just served, it was displayed, and the crowd wasn't there by accident. They were as much a part of the sentence as the gallows, the block, or the wheel. On the morning of an execution, the square began to fill before the sun cleared the rooftops. Farmers from outside the walls arrived with carts half unloaded, not wanting to miss the best view. Shopkeepers closed shutters for the morning, knowing their customers were already in the square. Children wove between legs, climbing onto barrels or hanging from wagon frames to see over the heads of adults. The mood was never the same twice. Sometimes it was hushed, almost reverent, especially when the condemned was a respected figure, or the crime carried political weight. Other days, it was noisy, bordering on festive. Vendors selling meat pies, cider, roasted nuts, and cheap trinkets to ward off bad luck from watching. For many, the day's grim business was also a rare public holiday. The front rows were the most coveted, but also the most dangerous, close enough to hear every word, see every gesture, and catch the metallic tang in the air when the moment came. Those in front could lock eyes with the condemned or with the executioner and feel for a heartbeat that the spectacle was meant for them alone. The condemned's entrance shifted the energy instantly. Murmurs swelled, voices sharpened. A hush might fall as they passed, only to break into jeers or shouts. Some shouted insults, some prayers, and some offers of last-minute forgiveness. In certain towns, friends or family members tried to press small coins into the executioner's hand, a silent plea for a swift end. And then there was the tension between fascination and revulsion. People told themselves they came to see justice done, but the truth was messier. Eyes that claimed to seek moral instruction were also eager for the shock of the unexpected. The slip of a rope, the second swing of a blade, the condemned's final outburst. These moments would be retold for months, woven into tavern stories and whispered warnings. The executioner knew this. He worked to the crowd without speaking to them, controlling their attention with his movements. A slow inspection of the rope, a deliberate lift of the sword to catch the light, a pause before the final act, letting silence settle like a weight. The audience leaned in, held in a grip as firm as any noose. There were times the crowd's mood turned. A botched stroke could spark outrage, stones thrown, or even an attempt to rush the scaffold. Some cheered at the end, others left quickly, their expressions unreadable. But all of them, every man, woman and child, carried the image home. It lived in their retellings, and in the lessons passed to children about what defiance, crime, or treachery brought. In this way, the crowd was more than witness. They were the living echo of the sentence, ensuring that the punishment didn't end when the body was carried away. And the executioner, He was not just an agent of the law, but the conductor of a grim orchestra, his silent cues drawing gasps, groans, and cheers in equal measure. By dusk the square would be empty again, but in kitchens and alehouses the execution would still play out in voices and gestures, each telling slightly different, each one keeping the memory alive. The spectacle was never just for the condemned, it was for everyone watching and everyone who would hear of it. That was the real sentence, and the crowd served it well. An executioner's pay was never just the coin stamped by the city's mint. Officially, there was a wage, a set sum for each sentence carried out, perhaps a yearly retainer from the magistrates to keep him ready at all times. But the real economy of the trade lived in the shadows, in folded scraps of cloth slipped into his hand, in promises whispered just before the final moment. The city's payment was steady but rarely generous, enough to keep a household fed, enough to maintain the tools, but never enough to erase the sense that this was a job for someone on the margins. The council liked it that way. They didn't want the executioner to grow too independent. In many towns, he was paid more like a craftsman than an officer, a man earning for each piece of work delivered. But then came the perks, those unspoken traditions that were never written into the law, but which everyone knew. In many places, the condemned's clothing automatically belonged to the executioner. If the prisoner had fine boots, a good belt, or a fur-lined cloak, it might be worth more than the official fee. Jewellery and personal trinkets were another matter. Sometimes they disappeared before the body was claimed. Some condemned men or their families understood this unspoken economy and acted accordingly. A discreet payment might ensure the rope was tied for a quick drop, that the sword fell with precision, that the breaking was done with fewer strokes. On darker days, a rival might pay to ensure the opposite, that the condemned lingered just long enough for a final humiliation. The executioner was careful with such deals. Too much cruelty and the crowd might turn, too much mercy and the magistrates might start asking questions. In some towns there were side jobs the council quietly approved. The executioner might be the one to dispose of diseased livestock, to clear the bodies of suicides from rivers, to deal with unclaimed corpses after plague. These paid in coin, food, or the right to sell what could be salvaged. Hides, bones, even fat for tallow. It was grisly work, but it blurred the line between punishment and public service. The bribes weren't always in money. A baker might offer bread for a month in exchange for the return of a family heirloom taken from the condemned. A brewer might send barrels of ale as thanks for a merciful morning. Sometimes it was protection, quiet promises that if the executioner's children ever needed help, certain doors would open. This barter system extended into strange corners. In Hamburg, there were tales of an executioner who collected herbs from the gallows field, selling them to apothecaries who swore they had unusual potency. In Prague, a headsman's wife was rumoured to trade small pieces of cloth from the clothing of executed criminals as charms against theft. Officially, the church condemned such practices. Unofficially, some priests looked the other way. The magistrates pretended not to know about these extra earnings, so long as the work was done and public order kept. It was a silent agreement. The executioner bore the city's dirty work, and in return, the city allowed him his own kind of dirty income. Still, every coin earned this way carried a weight. The executioner might never speak of it aloud, but he knew which cloak had been taken from a man who begged for his life, which gold ring once sat on the finger of a woman condemned for a crime that was as much politics as law. He could not spend such things without remembering, and yet he spent them, because in his trade sentiment didn't keep the fire lit or the sword sharp. By the year's end, the official ledger showed a modest living. The unofficial one, known only to the executioner and perhaps his wife, told a truer story, that the real profit came from what was never written down and never spoken of in daylight. By day, he was the city's necessary shadow. By night, he was just another man trying to live in a world that would never let him forget what he did. The executioner's life away from the scaffold was quieter, but never free of the work's mark. Most executioners lived on the edge of town, sometimes literally, in small houses just beyond the main gates. The reason was partly practical. The smell of hides, rope tar and iron from his other duties was not welcome near the market, but it was also a matter of comfort for the townsfolk, who preferred to keep a polite distance from the man who swung the blade. The road to his home was one most people didn't walk without a reason. Inside, the house could look like any other craftsman's. A hearth, a workbench, a chest for tools. The sword might rest in plain view, not for display, but because there was no need to hide it. His neighbours, few as they were, knew who he was and what he carried. Some greeted him politely, others crossed themselves as they passed. Children were often told not to linger near his door. Marriage was complicated. Many executioners wed within their own untouchable circle. Daughters of tanners, knackers, gravediggers, or other executioners. These families understood the bargain: respect in private, distance in public. A wife might handle the sale of goods taken from condemned criminals, or manage quiet deals with apothecaries for less respectable trades. In some households, the executioner's children grew up learning the craft without realizing how the rest of the town saw them. There was a strange kind of safety in his position. No thief dared break into his home. No drunk lingered too long outside. Even the most quarrelsome neighbour thought twice before picking a fight. Yet that safety came with isolation. Invitations to feast days or weddings rarely arrived. If he entered a tavern, conversation might falter until he sat in the far corner. And when he left, no one called after him to wish him a good night. Some tried to live like any other townsman, attending church, buying from the same market stalls, sending their children to school. But the line between the executioner and the man was thin. People might accept his coin, but wouldn't touch his hand. The priest would offer him the sacrament, but hesitate before blessing his home. In certain towns, his family had to sit in a separate section during services. Yet there were those who sought his company in secret. Soldiers respected his steady nerve. Merchants sometimes came to him to settle disputes, believing his word carried the weight of someone who had seen men at their final moment. And there were always people who needed quiet help. Moving a sick relative at night, protecting a daughter from a violent husband, retrieving something stolen without the courts knowing. The executioner could do such things discreetly, and often did for a price or a favour. This was the double life. In public, the embodiment of the city's punishment. In private, a man with debts, chores, and small joys. He might spend a morning sharpening his blade for an execution, then return home to mend a chair or teach his son to read. He might pass the afternoon in the garden trimming herbs that doubled as both seasoning and medicine. But the shadow was always there. At supper, his children might chatter about market gossip, but he would remember the faces of the day's crowd. Lying in bed, the sound of distant laughter might fade into the memory of a hush before a sentence was carried out. Even in his own home, he could never fully step out of the role. The townsfolk might try to avoid thinking about him between executions, but he never had that luxury. For him, the scaffold wasn't just a place he worked. It was a place that followed him home, quietly, every night. No one volunteered to become an executioner's apprentice. It was not a position sought, but one accepted, out of necessity, debt, punishment, or bloodline. In most towns, the path into the trade was set by family. A son trained under his father, just as the blade passed from one generation to the next. In other cases, the apprentice was a criminal given a choice between the noose and the hood. The first days were never about swinging a sword or tying a noose. They were about learning the craft in silence, carrying tools, setting up scaffolds, testing gallows pins, and sweeping the square after the crowd dispersed. The apprentice's hands became accustomed to rope fibres and oiled steel long before they were trusted with either in public. The lessons were practical, but edged with ritual. How to check the drop length without making it obvious to the crowd. How to position the block so the sun didn't blind the executioner at the wrong moment. How to fold a condemned man's cloak so it could be quietly claimed after the sentence. Every detail was part of the performance, even if the audience never saw it. And there were the less spoken lessons, the ones passed only in private, which officials paid promptly and which needed reminders, which priests would look the other way if a condemned man's ring went missing, how to sense the mood of a crowd and know when it was about to turn. The apprentice learned not just how to take a life, but how to survive in the role afterward. The first time an apprentice stepped onto the scaffold was rarely to deliver the final act. More often, it was to assist, holding the rope, adjusting the prisoner's position, wiping the blade after the stroke. These were small tasks, but each carried its own weight. Standing that close, the apprentice felt the crowd's eyes on him just as much as on the condemned. Mistakes were costly. An unsteady hand on the rope could delay the drop. A poorly set block could shift at the wrong moment. Even spilling sawdust in the wrong place could draw whispers about incompetence. The executioner's reputation depended on his apprentice's precision, and tempers flared when it was threatened. Over time, the apprentice would be trusted with more. Perhaps delivering a sentence in a smaller village under the master's watchful eye, or performing the preliminary work in cases where a prisoner faced more than one punishment. Each task was both a test and an initiation, proof that he could carry the burden without faltering. But with trust came the same isolation the master lived with. Friends from before the apprenticeship might stop visiting. Market stalls would serve him last. Women who once spoke freely now averted their eyes. The role followed him even when he was off duty, marking him as other before he had fully grown into it. For some apprentices, this life was a stepping stone, temporary work until they could slip away to another town and start fresh under a new name. For others, escape was impossible. They had inherited not just a trade, but an identity that clung like the scent of smoke in clothes. And for the few who embraced it, there was pride in mastering a craft that so few could perform without error. The master never said it aloud, but every apprentice knew the truth. The day would come when the crowd would watch him, not as a helper, but as the one who held the blade. When that day arrived, all the small unseen lessons would matter more than the steel in his hands. Because in the eyes of the city, the moment you stood in that place, you were no longer an apprentice. You were the executioner, and there was no stepping back. For an executioner, precision wasn't just a matter of pride, it was survival. One clean strike, one calculated drop, one final turn of the wheel, and the day's work could be finished with the dignity the law demanded. But when things went wrong, the scaffold could turn from a place of order into a tinderbox of fury. The most common disaster was the failed beheading. A sword or axe, if swung without the right angle or strength, could strike bone and stop short, forcing a second, even third blow. In the silent moments after such a mistake, the crowd's mood could shift like wind before a storm. Gasps, groans, and mutters of botched spread quickly, and with them anger, not just at the executioner's skill, but at the insult to the solemnity of the sentence. There are records from 17th century London of Jack Ketch, whose clumsy beheading of the Duke of Monmouth took several attempts. The crowd's jeers nearly drowned the final stroke, and Ketch's name became synonymous with incompetence for decades after. Even today, historians debate whether it was poor skill, nerves, or a deliberate show under orders. Whatever the truth, it made him a villain in the public eye overnight. Hanging had its own risks. A miscalculated drop could lead to a slow, drawn-out struggle instead of an instant end. If the rope snapped, which was rare but not impossible, it could spill chaos into the square. In some towns, this was seen as divine intervention, and the condemned might be pardoned. In others, the sentence would be carried out again immediately, to the crowd's deep discomfort. Either way, the executioner bore the blame for the failure, whether or not it was his fault. The wheel could splinter mid-sentence, a gallows beam could shift, a scaffold plank could give way. Each mishap turned the focus away from the condemned's crime and onto the man meant to deliver justice. Whispers of incompetence spread faster than news of 100 perfect executions. When a botched job happened, the executioner had to act quickly, not just to finish the sentence, but to control the crowd. A calm, decisive recovery could salvage his authority. Hesitation could invite disaster. There were cases where an enraged mob rushed the scaffold, attacking both guards and executioner. In Augsburg, one executioner in the 1500s barely escaped with his life, after a botched burning caused a panic. The crowd tore down part of the structure and had to be driven back by armed soldiers. Even without violence, the damage to reputation could be fatal to a career. A town might quietly replace an executioner after one public failure. In some places, a botched job meant exile, officially for incompetence, but often to appease public sentiment. No magistrate wanted the square to remember his justice as sloppy or cruel in the wrong way. Yet, ironically, some executioners believed a small flaw in performance could humanise them to the crowd, showing they were not mere machines of death. Others dismissed this as dangerous nonsense. The scaffold was no place for sentiment. Still, every executioner carried the memory of the day when something almost went wrong, the blade catching, the rope creaking under sudden strain, the crowd's murmur shifting to a low growl. Those moments lived longer than the hundreds of days when everything went exactly to plan. Because in this profession, a man's legacy was rarely the many he dispatched without incident. It was the one he didn't. Every city had its own stories about the great ones of the trade, executioners whose names survived in whispers, not because they were loved, but because they became part of the city's darker folklore. These men were both feared and oddly respected, remembered for their skill, their peculiar habits, or the scandalous cases they handled. One of the most famous was Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, who served from 1573 to 1617. Unlike most in his profession, Schmidt kept meticulous records, an executioner's diary that still survives. In it, he listed over 390 executions and hundreds more punishments, noting each one with a strange mixture of formality and detachment. Some entries were only a few words. Hans R. Thief, hanged. Others hinted at the drama behind the scaffold. A criminal who tried to bribe him moments before. A condemned woman who spat in his face. A nobleman who demanded to be killed standing up. Then there was Charles-Henri Sanson, the French executioner who presided over hundreds of deaths during the Revolution, including Louis XVI himself. Sanson was said to have the steady poise of a surgeon, even under the eyes of tens of thousands. Yet behind closed doors, he admitted that the royal execution haunted him for the rest of his life. Not for political reasons, but because of the strange intimacy of ending a man's life while the entire nation watched. Some executioners became notorious for their style rather than their count. In Italy, Giovanni Battista Bugatti, known as Mastro Titta, was the Papal State's official executioner for nearly 70 years. Dressed in a distinctive red cloak, he was both a public figure and a recluse. He would exchange polite greetings with locals one day and conduct an execution the next. Children were told to avoid him, but some claimed he handed out sweets on quiet afternoons, an unsettling reminder that the man with the axe was still human. And then there were the infamous cases, crimes and punishments that left scars on a city's memory. In Lübeck, an executioner was ordered to break a wealthy merchant on the wheel for treason. The crowd expected a swift display, but the magistrates instructed the executioner to make it last as a warning. For hours the square echoed with the sound of iron on wood, the merchant's voice growing faint until the final blow. The executioner's name was never forgotten, nor was the unspoken truth that justice had been mixed with revenge. Some cases were remembered for their defiance. A woman in Edinburgh, condemned for poisoning her husband, refused to kneel at the block, forcing the executioner to strike while she stood. The blow was clean, but the image burned itself into the city's gossip. For months, people claimed to see her shadow in the winds after dark. In smaller towns, a single scandal could define an executioner's career. A botched job might make him the subject of cruel songs. A particularly dramatic confession could make him the unwilling custodian of the town's new favourite legend. These stories were passed down like heirlooms, half history, half superstition, but always with the executioner at the centre. Fame in this trade was a double-edged sword. It brought a certain power, even a strange kind of celebrity, but it also meant the eyes of the city followed every move. One slip, one rumour, one political shift, and the same fame could turn to infamy overnight. And so the executioner lived with a paradox. His best work was done in silence and efficiency, yet it was the noisy, messy, or extraordinary cases that ensured his name would outlive him. In the end, whether remembered as a master of his craft or a symbol of cruelty, he had no say in how history wrote his final record. No execution ended when the crowd dispersed. In the alleys, in the market stalls, in the smoky corners of taverns, the day's work lived on, in whispers, in bargains, and in the quiet exchange of objects that never should have left the scaffold. The medieval mind was a nest of superstition, and the scaffold was one of its richest breeding grounds. People believed the touch of a hanged man's hand could cure warts, that a rope used in an execution could bring luck in gambling or ensure a lover's loyalty. A tooth from the condemned was said to protect against the evil eye. None of these beliefs appeared in any church sermon, but they flourished all the same. The executioner stood at the centre of this strange economy. Officially, he was not supposed to sell anything taken from the condemned. Unofficially, many saw it as part of his trade. The rope cut from a gallows could fetch a high price, especially if it had taken the life of a well-known criminal. Bits of cloth buttons or shoes were passed discreetly from hand to hand, traded for coins, wine or favours. Even the earth beneath the scaffold was considered powerful. In some towns, after a particularly notable execution, people would scrape up handfuls of dirt and hide them in their homes as protection, or as a curse against enemies. The executioner might sell this himself, or leave it to others to profit from the crowd's belief. More sinister were the uses in folk medicine. Fat rendered from the bodies of the executed was rumoured to be a potent healing salve, particularly for broken bones. Blood, if caught fresh, was said to cure epilepsy. Official law condemned such practices, but demand always found a supplier. Sometimes the executioner's wife or a trusted go-between handled the sale, keeping the master's hands clean in public. There were also objects kept not for luck or healing, but for power. In Germany, tales spoke of the hand of glory, a preserved hand of a hanged man, used by thieves to enter homes unseen. Whether it truly worked or not hardly mattered. The belief was enough to keep the trade alive. Executioners, tanners, and even certain priests were rumoured to be involved in crafting them. Superstitions weren't limited to the living. Some believed that if the executioner buried the condemned in a certain way, face down, or with a stake through the heart, it would prevent the spirit from wandering. Others swore that failing to do so would doom the town to bad harvests, plague, or storms. Whether or not the executioner believed these things himself, he often went along with them. It kept the peace, and sometimes it brought in extra coin. And then there were the more personal talismans, items the executioner kept for himself. A coin given by a condemned man before the stroke. A fragment of rope from a notorious case. These were never sold, never shown. They were reminders of mistakes avoided, of jobs that haunted the mind, of the strange bond that sometimes formed between the executioner and the condemned in those final minutes. To outsiders, this trade in relics and charms seemed like grotesque superstition, but for those who lived in the shadow of the scaffold, it was part of the world's fabric. One of the many ways the line between justice, commerce, and belief blurred until no one could say where one ended and the other began. In this way, the executioner was not just the city's instrument of death, he was also its quiet merchant of the forbidden, selling pieces of fear and fascination to those who claimed not to want them, but always came back for more. An executioner was never just a servant of the law, he was an arm of power. The scaffold was as much a political stage as it was a place of justice, and the man who stood upon it was often caught in the middle of struggles that reached far beyond the crimes written in court records. When rulers wanted to send a message, they didn't write letters, they held executions. A thief could be punished quietly in a prison yard, but a traitor, a rebel, or a religious dissenter was brought into the public square. The sentence became a performance, carefully choreographed to show the ruler's reach. The executioner's skill was crucial, not just for delivering the sentence, but for making sure the display had the intended effect. In times of political unrest, this could mean more than a clean job. The condemned might be dressed in a way that marked them as an enemy. Robes of a rival faction, the badge of a rebellious city, or a symbol of their faith. The scaffold might be built higher, the timing chosen for a festival day, when the square would be overflowing. Every detail was aimed at making the execution echo through the streets, long after the body was gone. Sometimes the message was aimed at specific people in the crowd. In Florence, a noble suspected of plotting against the city was executed in full view of his allies. The executioner ordered to make the moment linger just long enough for them to understand what awaited them. In England, rebels from the north were drawn through the streets before their deaths, their journey a slow-moving threat to anyone else thinking of rising up. But playing politics with the scaffold was dangerous. The executioner might be ordered to make a sentence harsher than usual, or to stage a moment of humiliation. One wrong move, too much cruelty, too little spectacle, and the public mood could turn, not against the ruler, but against the man with the blade. Many executioners learned to read the crowd as carefully as they read the orders, adjusting their pace and manner to avoid a riot. There were also moments when the executioner was used as a political shield. Rulers could hide behind his presence, letting him absorb the anger for a controversial sentence. When a popular figure was condemned, the executioner became the visible villain, the one whose face the people remembered, not the judges or princes who had decreed the death. And then there were the cases where the executioner quietly resisted. Some delayed the moment, giving the condemned a chance to speak their final words clearly, knowing those words might undermine the official narrative. Others ensured a swift, merciful end despite orders to prolong it, protecting the condemned's dignity in defiance of the court's wishes. Such acts were dangerous, but they happened more often than the records admit. In this way, the executioner walked a narrow line between loyalty to his masters and survival among the people. He was a servant of both fear and order, a man whose every movement could be read as a signal, and when the crowd dispersed, the message lingered. The ruler's hand was long, the punishment certain, and the man who carried it out would be waiting should you forget. For the condemned, the scaffold was the end. For the ruler, it was a statement. But for the executioner, it was another day in the delicate balancing act between justice, politics, and self-preservation. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, the role of the medieval executioner was fading into something very different. Cities were growing, law codes were changing, and the public's appetite for blood in the square was beginning to wane. What had once been a central act of civic life, a crowd gathered to watch the law take its most final form, was slowly shifting behind walls. Part of this was due to changing ideas about justice. Philosophers and reformers argued that executions should be swift, private, and free from the carnival atmosphere that had surrounded them for centuries. Public punishments, they said, brutalised the onlookers as much as the condemned. Rulers began to see the wisdom in this, not out of mercy necessarily, but out of a desire for control. Crowds were unpredictable, a closed courtyard was not. For the executioner, this meant a strange mix of relief and loss. Gone were the days of balancing on a scaffold before hundreds of eyes, the press of the crowd, the tense silence before the signal. Now, his work was done in prison yards, behind locked gates, with only a few officials present. The drama was gone, replaced by procedure. His social position shifted too. In earlier centuries, the executioner's infamy had been offset by a certain notoriety. Everyone knew his name, his face, his craft. Now, anonymity became a shield. In some countries, the names of executioners were no longer published, allowing them to live more ordinary lives. The isolation remained, but the spectacle, the strange, terrible fame, began to disappear. New technologies also changed the work. The sword and axe gave way to the guillotine in France, hailed as a more humane method. Hanging became standardised, with careful measurements and regulations designed to remove the risk of botched drops. The executioner's skill still mattered, but it was increasingly about precision in preparation rather than performance in front of a crowd. Some adapted, becoming almost bureaucrats of death, following schedules, filing reports, maintaining equipment. Others struggled, feeling their craft reduced to mechanical routine. The old stories, the strange traditions, the unspoken negotiations with condemned and crowd alike, all of it was slipping away. By the 20th century in much of Europe, the role was nearly gone. Some countries abolished the death penalty altogether. Others kept it but carried it out behind closed doors, with the executioner's name known only to a handful of officials. The last of the old masters died with little ceremony, their tools ending up in museums or private collections. What remained were the stories, the diaries of men like Franz Schmidt, the legends of botched jobs and infamous cases, the folklore of ropes, charms, and strange cures. In the popular imagination, the medieval executioner remained a figure in a black hood, looming over a block. In reality, he had been many things: a craftsman, a servant of power, an outcast, a merchant of superstition, and sometimes just a man doing a job the rest of the world didn't want to touch. His profession may have faded, but his shadow still lingers. In history books, in superstition, and in the uneasy fascination people still have with the figure who once stood at the very edge between life and death, holding the city's most terrible responsibility in his hands. Long after the last public scaffold was dismantled, the executioner's shadow refused to fade. His figure, real or imagined, still stalked the corridors of history, cloaked in superstition, cruelty, and an uneasy respect. The man himself may have been buried without ceremony, his name forgotten in official records, but the myths clung tighter than the truth ever could. Popular imagination kept him simple. A faceless hood, a gleaming axe, a single, brutal moment. It was easier that way. The real executioner who bargained for mercy, who carried home a condemned man's cloak, who buried the guilty and the innocent alike, was too complicated, too uncomfortable. History, as it is often told, prefers symbols to people. In tavern tales and whispered warnings, the executioner became more than a man. He was an omen, a figure you might glimpse in the corner of your eye on a foggy night, or hear in the measured footsteps echoing down an empty street. Parents used his name to frighten children into obedience. Lovers invoked him in curses, soldiers in crude jokes. The myth had replaced the flesh, and perhaps that was the final mercy he was given. Some of the superstitions survived far longer than the profession itself. Well into the modern age, there were gamblers who swore a rope from the gallows brought luck. There were farmers who buried shards of scaffold wood in their fields for a better harvest. In remote villages, people still told stories of executioners who could stop a storm, or curse a household, or heal a wound with a single touch. The truth was that the executioner had always been both more and less than the myths made him. He was not an unfeeling monster, nor a noble servant of justice. He was a man who lived between two worlds, inside the law but never fully within society, feared and needed in equal measure. His life was shaped by the crimes of others, yet judged entirely by his own precision in ending them. Standing on that scaffold, he carried more than a sword or rope. He carried the weight of the crowd's gaze, the court's orders, and the knowledge that his own fate could turn with a single mistake. His name might not be carved into any monument, but the echoes of his work are still there, in every courtroom where the death penalty is debated, in every crime story that draws an audience hungry for the edge of horror. And so, the legacy of the medieval executioner endures, not because people truly remember him, but because they remember the feeling he inspired. The tension in the air as the crowd held its breath, the strange mingling of justice, fear and fascination. The knowledge that, for one moment, all eyes turned toward a single figure who would decide how cleanly the line between life and death would be drawn. History may have stripped away his scaffold and his public stage, but the myths remain, sharper than any blade he ever held. And perhaps in the end, that was always his most lasting sentence, not the ones he carried out on others, but the one history passed on him.